Mike Duffy, as everyone knows, is pleading not guilty to a whole bunch of fraud, breach of trust charges, and the bribery charge, the allegation, which is at the sort of center of it all. This involves his acceptance of a $90,000 bank draft from the Prime Minister's former Chief of Staff, Nigel Wright. And I think anyone who has been at the trial, which is now I think in its 39th day or maybe the 40th day, I have lost count, over many months, anyone who's been in the courtroom I think would grant that there's every possibility that because the Senate rules were in such a disgraceful state, they didn't say anything, they were vague, they allowed the very sort of wiggle room which Mr. Duffy is now taking advantage of, in fact, here in this courtroom. But in any case, if you've been in the courtroom for all this time or been following the trial closely, I think you'd certainly grant that there's every chance that he could be found not guilty, that Justice Vaillancourt, the judge, might say, well, you know, there were no rules, they weren't definite enough, Mr. Duffy thought he was doing the right thing on many of the charges, perhaps even on all of them, who knows. But the one thing anyone who's been in that courtroom would never say is that Mike Duffy was a victim. And that's how his lawyer, Don Bain, has for 2 days now, well, for the whole trial, but in cross-examining Nigel Wright, he's really going to town on this. Poor Mr. Duffy had no free will. He had this big, bad Nigel Wright, who is, by the way, a diminutive, very fit man, but small, not physically imposing, unlike Mike Duffy, who was, you know, bullying him into acquiescence and making him agree when he, Mike Duffy, believed in his heart of hearts that he'd done nothing wrong, making him agree to take the money and go away and the problem would be fine. There is no way. Mike Duffy might very well be not guilty, but he's not a victim. And all you have to do to remember that to recognize that is to remember, I think it was December 22nd, he was appointed to the Senate, he got the magic phone call he'd been seeking for so long. And a couple of weeks later, before he'd been sworn in officially, but he was a senator, and he filed his first expense claim. And there he was, living in his house in Canada, sleeping in the same bed he'd been sleeping in for 5 years, eating the same food, leading the same life, and now he was charging expenses because he was on travel status while living in his own house. Now, what a sweet deal is that, eh? Travel status in your own house to the tune of about $900 or something a month. So, to Mr. Bain, I say, good effort, sir. Magnificent try. Your client may well be not guilty, but the one thing he isn't is a victim.